Chapter 6 of The Lucky Piece, A Tale of the North Woods by Albert Bigelow Paine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6 In the Devil's Garden. Constance Deane had developed a definite ambition. At all events, she believed it to be such, which, after all, is much the same thing in the end. It was her dream to pursue this new study of hers until she had made a definite place for herself, either as a recognized authority or by some startling discovery in mycological annals. In fact, to become in some measure a benefactor of mankind. The spirit of unrest which had possessed her that afternoon in March, when she had lamented that the world held no place for her, had found at least a temporary outlet in this direction. We all have had such dreams as hers. They are part of youth. Often they seem paltry enough to others, perhaps to us as well, when the morning hours have passed by. But those men and women who have made such dreams real have given us a wiser and better world. Constance had confided something of her intention to Frank, who had at least assumed to take it seriously, following her in her wanderings, pushing through tangle and thicket and clambering over slippery logs into uncertain places for possible treasures of discovery. His reluctance to scale McIntyre, though due to the reasons given rather than to any thought of personal discomfort, had annoyed her, the more so because of the unpleasant incident which followed. There had been a truce at luncheon, but once in the woods, Miss Deane did not hesitate to unburden her mind. "Do you know," she began judiciously, as if she had settled the matter in her own mind, "I have about concluded that you are hopeless after all." The culprit, who had just dragged himself from under a rather low-lying wet log, assumed an injured air. "What can I have done now?" he asked. "It's not what you have done, but what you haven't done. You're so satisfied to be just comfortable and—" Frank regarded his earthy hands and soiled garments rather ruefully. "Of course," he admitted, "I may have looked comfortable just now, rooting and pawing about in the leaves for that specimen, but I didn't really feel so." "You know well enough what I mean," Constance persisted, though a little more pacifically. "You go with me willingly enough on such jaunts as this, where it doesn't mean any very special exertion, though sometimes I think you don't enjoy them very much. I know you would much rather drift about in a boat on the lake, or sit under a tree and have me read to you. Do you know, I've never seen anyone who cared so much for old tales of knights and their deeds of valor, and strove so little to emulate them in real life." Frank waited a little before replying. Then he said gently, "I confess that I would rather listen to the tale of King Arthur in these woods, and as you read it, Connie, than to attempt deeds of valor on my own account. When I am listening to you and looking off through these wonderful woods, I can realize and believe in it all, just as I did long ago, when I was a boy and read it for the first time. These are the very woods of romance, and I am expecting any day we shall come upon King Arthur's castle. When we do, I shall join the Round Table and ride for you in the lists. Meantime, I can dream it all to the sound of your voice, and when I see the people here climbing these mountains and boasting of such achievements, I decide that my dream is better than their reality." But Miss Deane's memory of the recent circumstances still rankled. She was not to be easily mollified. "And while you dream, I am to find reality as best I may," she said coldly. "But, Constance," he protested, "haven't I climbed trees and gone down into pits and waded through swamps and burrowed through vines and briars at your command? And haven't I more than once tasted of the things that you were not perfectly sure of, Because the book didn't exactly cover the specimen? Now, here I'm told that I'm hopeless, which means that I'm a failure, when even at this moment I bear the marks of my devotion." He pointed at the knees of his trousers, damp from his recent experience. "I've done battle with nature," he went on, "and entered the lists with your detractors. You said once there are knights we do not recognize, and armor we do not see. Now, don't you think you may be overlooking one of those knights, with a suit of armor a little damp at the knees, perhaps, but still stout and serviceable?" The girl did not, as usual, respond to his gaiety and banter. "You may joke about it if you like," she said, "but true knights, even in the garb of peasants, have been known to scale dizzy heights for a single flower. I have never known of one who refused to accompany a lady on such an errand, especially when it was up an easy mountain trail which even children have climbed." "Then this is a notable day, for you have met two." She nodded. "But one was without blame, and but for the first there could not have occurred the humiliation of the second, and that, too," she smiled in spite of herself, "in the presence of my detractors. It will be hard for you to rectify that, Sir Knight." There was an altered tone in the girl's voice. The humorous phrase was coming nearer the surface. Frank brightened. "Really, though," he persisted, "I was right about its being foggy up here. Farnham would have said so himself." "No doubt," she agreed, "but we could have reached that conclusion later. An expressed willingness to go would have spared me and all of us what followed. As it is, Edith Morrison thinks I wanted to deprive her of Robin on his one day at home, while he was obliged to make himself appear foolish before everyone." "I wish you had as much consideration for me as you always show for Robin," said Frank, becoming suddenly aggrieved. "And why not for Robin?" The girl's voice became sharply crisp and defiant. "Who is entitled to it more than he, a poor boy who struggled when no more than a child to earn bread for his invalid mother and little sister, who has never had a penny that he did not earn, who never would take one, but in spite of all has fought his way to recognition and respect and knowledge? Oh, you don't know how he has struggled, you who have had everything from birth, who have never known what it is not to gratify every wish, nor what it feels like to go hungry and cold that someone else might be warm and fed." Miss Deane's cheeks were aglow, and her eyes were filled with fire. "It is by such men as Robin Farnham," she went on, "that this country has been built, with all its splendid achievements and glorious institutions, and the possibilities for such fortunes as yours. Why should I not respect him and honor him and love him, if I want to?" she concluded, carried away by her enthusiasm. Frank listened gravely to the end. Then he said very gently, "There is no reason why you should not honor and respect such a man, nor, perhaps, why you should not love him, if you want to. I am sure Robin Farnham is a very worthy fellow. But I suppose even you do not altogether realize the advantage of having been poor—" The girl was about to break in, but checked herself. "Of having been poor," he repeated, "and compelled to struggle from the beginning. It gets to be a habit, you see, a sort of groundwork for character. Perhaps—I do not say it, mind, I only say perhaps—if Robin Farnham had been born with my advantages and I with his, it might have made a difference, don't you think, in your very frank and just estimate of us today? I have often thought that it is a misfortune to have been born with money, but I suppose I didn't think of it soon enough, and it seems pretty late now to go back and start all over. Besides, I have no one in need to struggle for. My mother is comfortably off, and I have no little suffering sister." She checked him a gesture. "Don't, oh, don't," she pleaded. "Perhaps you are right about being poor, but that last seems mockery and sacrilege. I cannot bear it. You don't know what you are saying. You don't know, as I do, how he has gone out in the bitter cold to work, without his breakfast, because there was not enough for all, and how, because he has cooked the breakfast himself, he did not let them know. No, you do not realize. You could not." Mr. Weatherby regarded his companion rather wonderingly. There was something in her eyes which made them very bright. It seemed to him that her emotion was hardly justified. "I suppose he has told you all about it," he said, rather coldly. She turned upon him. "He? Never. He would never tell any one. I found it out, oh, long ago, but I did not understand it all, not then." "And the mother and sister? What became of them?" The girl's voice steadied itself with difficulty. "The mother died. The little girl was taken by some kind people. He was left to fight his battle alone." Neither spoke after this, and they walked through woods that were like the mazy forests of some old tale. If there had been a momentary rancor between them, it was presently dissipated in the quiet of the gold-lit scenery about them, and as they wandered on there grew about them a peace which needed no outward establishment. They held their course by a little compass, and did not fear losing their way, though it was easy enough to become confused amid those barriers of heaped boulders and tangled logs. By and by Constance held up her hand. "Listen," she said. "There are voices." They halted, and a moment later Robin Farnham and Edith Morrison emerged from a natural avenue just ahead. They had followed a different way and were returning to the Lodge. Frank and Constance pushed forward to meet them. "We have just passed a place that would interest you," said Robin to Miss Deane. "A curious, shut-in place where mushrooms grow almost as if they had been planted there. We will take you to it." Robin spoke in his usual manner. Edith, though rather quiet, appeared to have forgotten the incident of the veranda. Frank and Constance followed a little way, and then, all at once, they were in a spot where the air seemed heavy and chill, as though a miasma rose from the yielding soil. Thick boughs interlaced overhead, and the sunlight of summer never penetrated there. Such light as came through seemed dim and sorrowful, and there was about the spot a sinister aspect that may have been due to the black pool in the center and the fungi which grew about it. Pale, livid growths were there, shading to sickly yellow, and in every form and size. So thick were they fairly overhung and crowded in that gruesome bed. Here a myriad of tiny stems, there great distorted shapes pushed through decaying leaves, or toppled over, split and rotting, the food of buzzing flies, thousands of which lay dead upon the ground. A sickly odor hung about the ghastly place. No one spoke at first. Then Constance said, "I believe they are all deadly, every one." And Frank added, "I have heard of the Devil's Garden. I think we have found it." Edith Morrison shuddered. Perhaps the life among the hills had made her a trifle superstitious. "Let us be going," Constance said. "Even the air of such a place may be dangerous." Then, curiosity and the collecting instinct getting the better of her, she stooped and plucked one of the yellow fungi which grew near her foot. "They seem to be all amanitas," she added, "the most deadly of toadstools. Those paler ones are Amanita phalloides." There is no cure for their poison. These are called the fly amanita because they attract flies and slay them, as you see. This yellow one is an amanita, too. See its poison cup? I do not know its name, and we won't stop here to find it, but I think we might call it the Yellow Danger." She dropped it into the basket, and all turned their steps homeward, the two girls ahead, the men following. The unusual spot had seemed to depress them all. They spoke but little, and in hushed voices. When they emerged from the woods, the sun had slipped behind the hills, and a semi-twilight had fallen. Day had become a red stain in the west. Constance turned suddenly to Robin Farnham. "I think I will ask you to row me across the lake," she said. "I am sure Mr. Weatherby will be glad to surrender the privilege. I want to ask you something more about those specimens you saw on McIntyre." There was no hint of embarrassment in Miss Deane's manner of this request. Indeed, there was a pleasant, matter-of-fact tone in her voice that to the casual hearer would have disarmed any thought of suspicion. Yet to Edith and Frank the matter seemed ominously important. They spoke their adieus pleasantly enough, but a curious spark glittered a little in the girl's eyes, and the young man's face was grave as they too watched the handsome pair down the slope, and saw them enter the Adirondack canoe and glide out into the iridescent water. Suddenly Edith turned to her companion. She was very pale, and the spark had become almost a blaze. "Mr. Weatherby," she said fiercely, "you and I are a pair of fools. You may not know it, perhaps even they do not know it, yet, but it is becoming very clear to me." Frank was startled by her unnatural look and tone. As he stood regarding her, he saw her eyes suddenly flood with tears. The words did not come easily either to deny or acknowledge her conclusions. Then, very gently, as one might speak to a child, he said, "Let us not be too hasty in our judgments. Very sad mistakes have been made by being too hasty." He looked out at the little boat, now rapidly blending into the shadows of the other shore, and added, to himself as it seemed, "I have made so little effort to be what she wished. He is so much nearer to her ideal." He turned to say something more to the girl beside him, but she had slipped away and was already halfway to the lodge. He followed, and then for a time sat out on the veranda, smoking, and reviewing what seemed to him now the wasted years. He recalled his old ambitions. Once they had been for the sea, the Navy. Then, when he had become associated with the college paper, he had foreseen in himself the editor of some great journal, with power to upset conspiracies and to unmake kings. Presently he had begun to write. He had always dabbled in that. And his fellow students had hailed him not only as their leader in athletic but literary pursuits. As editor-in-chief of the college paper and valedictorian of his class, he had left them at last, followed by prophecies of a career in the world of letters. Well, that was more than 2 years ago, and he had never picked up his pen since that day. There had been so many other things, so many places to go, so many pleasant people, so much to do that was easier than to sit down at a remote desk with pen and blank paper, when all the world was young and filled with gayer things. Then, presently, he had reasoned that there was no need of making the fight. There were too many at it now. So the flower of ambition had faded as quickly as it had bloomed, and the blossoms of pleasure had been gathered with a careless hand. His meeting with Constance had been a part of the play life of which he had grown so fond. Now that she had grown into his life, he seemed about to lose her, because of the flower he had let die. The young man ate his dinner silently, supplying his physical needs in the perfunctory manner of routine. He had been late coming in, and the dining room was nearly empty. Inadvertently, he approached the group gathered about the wide hall fireplace as he passed out. Miss Carroway occupied the center of this little party, and, as usual, was talking. She appeared to be arranging some harmless evening amusement. "It's always pleasant after supper," she was saying. Miss Carroway never referred to the evening meal as dinner. "To ask a few conundrums. My Charlie that I raised and is now in the electric works at Haverford used to say it helped digestion. Now, suppose we begin. I'll ask the first one, and each one will guess in turn. The first one who guesses can ask the next." Becoming suddenly conscious of the drift of matters, Frank started to back out, silently, but Miss Carroway had observed his entrance and, turning, checked him with her eye. "You're just in time," she said. "We haven't commenced yet. Oh, yes, you must stay. It's good for young people to have a little diversion in the evening and not go poking off alone. I am just about to ask the first conundrum. Maybe you'll get the next. This is one that Charlie always liked. What's the difference between a fountain and the Prince of Wales? Now, you begin, Mr. Weatherby, and see if you can guess it." The feeling was borne in upon Frank that this punishment was rather more than he could bear, and he made himself strong for the ordeal. Dutifully he considered the problem and passed it on to the little woman in black, who sat next. Miss Carroway's rival was consumed with an anxiety to cheapen the problem with a prompt answer. "That's easy enough," she said. "One's the son of the Queen, and the other's the Queen of the Sun. Of course," she added, "a fountain isn't really a Queen of the Sun, but it shines and sparkles and might be called that." Miss Carroway regarded her with something of disdain. "Yes," she said with decision, "it might be, but it ain't. You guessed wrong. Next." "One's always wet and the other's always dry," volunteered an irreverent young person outside the circle, which remark won a round of ill-deserved applause. "You ought to come into the game," commented Miss Carroway. "But that ain't it either." "I'm sure it has something with shine and line," ventured the young lady from Utica, who was a schoolmistress. "Or earth and birth. I know I've heard it, but I can't remember." "Huh!" sniffed Miss Carroway and passed it on. Nobody else ventured a definition, and the problem came back to its proposer. She sat up a bit straighter and swept the circle with her firelit glasses. "One's thrown to the air and the other's heir to the throne," she declared, as if pronouncing judgment. "I don't think this is much of a conundrum, crowd. My Charlie would have guessed that the first time. But I'll give you one more, something easier and maybe older." When at last he was permitted to go, Frank made his way gloomily to his room and to bed. The day's events had been depressing. He had lost ground with Constance, whom of late he had been trying so hard to please. He had been willing enough, he reflected, to go up the mountain, but it really had been cloudy up there and too late to start. Then Constance had blamed him for the unpleasant incident which had followed, it seemed to him rather unjustly. Now Edith Morrison had declared openly what he himself had been almost ready, though rather vaguely, to suspect. He had let Constance slip through his fingers, after all. He groaned aloud at the thought of Constance as the wife of another. Was it, after all, too late? If he should begin now to do and dare and conquer, could he regain the lost ground? And how should he begin? Half confused with approaching sleep, his thoughts intermingled with strange fancies that one moment led him to the mountain top, where in the mist he groped for mushrooms, while the next, as in a picture, he was achieving some splendid triumph and laying the laurels at her feet. Then he was wide awake again, listening to the whisper of the trees that came through his open window and the murmur of voices from below. Presently he found himself muttering, "What is the difference between a fountain and the Prince of Wales?" A question which immediately became a part of his perplexing sleep-waking fancies, and the answer was something which, like a boat in the mist, drifted away, just out of reach. What was the difference between a fountain and the Prince of Wales? It seemed important that he should know. And then the query became visualized in a sunlit plume of leaping water with a diadem at the top. And this suddenly changed into a great mushroom of the color of gold, and of which someone was saying, "Don't touch it, it's the yellow danger." Perhaps that was Edith Morrison, for he saw her dark, handsome face just then, her eyes bright with tears and fierce with the blaze of jealousy. Then he slept. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The Lucky Piece, A Tale of the North Woods by Albert Bigelow Paine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. The Path That Leads Back to Boyhood. The sun was not yet above the hills when Frank Weatherby left the lodge next morning. He halted for a moment to procure some convenient receptacle and was supplied with a trout basket, which, slung across his shoulder, gave him quite the old feeling of preparation for a day's sport, instead of merely an early trip up McIntyre. Robin Farnham was already up and away with his party, but another guide loitered about the cabin and showed a disposition to be friendly. "Better wait till after breakfast," he said. "It don't take long to run up McIntyre and back. You'll have plenty of time." "But it looks clear up there now. It may be foggy later on. Besides, I've just bribed the cook to give me a bite, so I'm not afraid of getting hungry." The guide brought out a crumpled, rusty-looking fly-hook and a little roll of line. "Take these," he urged. "You'll cross a brook or two where there's some trout. Maybe you can get a few while you're resting. I'd lend you a rod if we had one here, but you can cut a switch that will do. The fish are mostly pretty small." The sight of the gaily colored flies, the line, and the feeling of the basket at his side was a combination not to be resisted. The years seemed to roll backward, and Frank felt the old eager longing to be following the tumbling, swirling water, to feel the sudden tug at the end of a drifting line. It was a rare morning. The abundant forest was rich with every shade of green and bright with dew. Below, where the path lay, it was still dim and silent, but the earliest touch of sunrise had set the treetops aglow and started a bird concert in the high branches. The McIntyre trail was not a hard one to follow. Neither was it steep for a considerable distance, and Frank strode along rapidly and without fatigue. In spite of his uneasiness of spirit the night before, he had slept the sleep of youth and health, and the smell of the morning woods, the feel of the basket at his side, the following of this fascinating trail brought him nearer to boyhood with every forward step. He would go directly to the top of the mountain, he thought, find the curious flower or fungus which Robin had seen, and on his return trip would stop at the brooks and perhaps bring home a basket of trout, after which he would find Constance and lay the whole at her feet as a proof that he was not altogether indifferent to her wishes. Also, it might be, as a token that he had renewed his old ambition to be something more than a mere lover of ease and pleasure and a dreamer of dreams. The suspicion stirred by Edith Morrison the night before had grown dim. Indeed, had almost vanished in the clear glow of morning. Constance might wish to punish him, that was quite likely, though it was highly improbable that she should have selected this method. In fact, it was quite certain that any possibility of causing heartache, especially where Edith Morrison was concerned, would have been most repugnant to a girl of the character and ideals of Constance Deane. She admired Robin and found pleasure in his company. That she made no concealment of these things was the best evidence that there was nothing to be concealed. That unconsciously she and Robin were learning to care for each other, he thought most unlikely. He remembered Constance as she had seemed during the days of their meeting at Lennox, when she had learned to know, and he believed to care for him. It had never been like that. It would not be like that now with another. There would be no other. He would be more as she would have him, more like Robin Farnham. Why, he was beginning this very moment. Those years of idleness had dropped away. He had regarded himself as beyond the time of beginning. What nonsense! At 24, full of health and the joy of living, swinging up a mountain trail to win a flower for the girl he loved, with a cavalcade of old hopes and dreams and ambitions once more riding through his heart. Today was life. Yesterday was already with the vanished ages. Then for a moment he recalled the sorrow of Edith Morrison and resolved within him to see her immediately upon his return, to prove to her how groundless and unjust had been her conclusions. She was hardly to blame. She was only a mountain girl and did not understand. It was absurd that he, who knew so much of the world and of human nature, should have followed himself even for a moment to be influenced by the primitive notions of this girl of the hills. The trail grew steeper now. The young man found himself breathing a trifle quicker as he pushed upward. Sometimes he seized a limb to aid him in swinging up a rocky steep. Again he parted dewy bushes that locked their branches across the way. Presently there was a sound of water falling over stones, and a moment later he had reached a brook that hurried down the mountainside, leaping and laughing as it ran. There was a narrow place and a log where the trail crossed, with a little fall and a deep pool just below it. Frank did not mean to stop for trout now, but it occurred to him to try this brook, that he might judge which was the better to fish on his return. He looked about until he found a long, slim shoot of some tough wood, and this he cut for a rod. Then he put on a bit of the line. A longer piece would not do in this little stream, and at the end he strung a short leader and 2 flies. It was queer, but he found his fingers trembling just a little with eagerness as he adjusted those flies, and when he held the rig at arm's length and gave it a little twitch in the old way it was not so bad, after all, he thought. As he stealthily gained the exact position where he could drop the lure on the eddy below the fall, and poised the slender rod for the cast, the only earthly thing that seemed important was the placing of those 2 tiny bits of gimp and feathers just on that spot where the water swirled under the edge of the black overhanging rock. Gently now, so. A quick flash, a swish, a sharp, thrilling tug, an instinctive movement of the wrist, and something was leaping and glancing on the pebbles below, something dark and golden and gaily red-spotted, something which no man who has ever trailed a brook can see without a quickening heart, a speckled trout. Certainly it was but a boy who leaped down and disentangled the captured fish and held it joyously for a moment, admiring its markings and its size before dropping it into the basket at his side. "Pretty good for such a little brook," he said aloud. "I wonder if there are many like that." He made another cast, but without result. "I've frightened them," he thought. "I came lumbering down like a duffer. Besides, they can see me here." He turned and followed the stream with his eye. It seemed a succession of falls and fascinating pools, and the pools grew even larger and more enticing. He could not resist trying just once more, and when another goodly trout was in his creel and then another, all else in life became hazy in the joy of following that stream from fall to fall and from pool to pool, of dropping those gay little flies just in the particular spot which would bring that flash and swish, that delightful tug, and the gaily speckled capture that came glancing to his feet. Why not do his fishing now, in these morning hours when the time was right? Later the sport might be poor, or none at all. At this rate he could soon fill his creel and then make his way up the mountain. He halted a moment to line the basket with damp moss and water grasses to keep his catch fresh. Then he put aside every other purpose for the business of the moment, creeping around bushes or leaping from stone to stone, sometimes slipping to his knees in the icy water, caring not for discomfort or bruises, heedless of everything except the zeal of pursuit and the zest of capture, the glory of the bright singing water, spilling from pool to pool, the filtering sunlight, the choiring birds, the resinous smell of the forest, all the things which lure the feet of young men over the paths trod by their fathers in the long forgotten days. The stream widened. The pools grew deeper and the trout larger as he descended. Soon he decided to keep only the larger fish. All others he tossed back as soon as taken. Then there came a break ahead, and presently the brook pitched over a higher fall than any he had passed into a larger stream, almost a river. A great regret came upon the young man as he viewed this fine water that rushed and swirled among 1,000 boulders, ideal stepping stones with ideal pools below. Oh, now for a rod and reel, with a length of line to cast far ahead into those splendid pools. The configuration of the land caused this larger stream to pursue a course around rather than down the mountainside, and Frank decided that he could follow it for a distance and then, with the aid of his compass, strike straight for the mountain top without making his way back upstream. But first he must alter his tackle. He looked about and presently cut a much longer and stronger rod and lengthened his line accordingly. Then he made his way among the boulders and began to whip the larger pools. Cast after cast resulted in no return. He began to wonder, after all, if it would not be a mistake to fish this larger and less fruitful stream. But suddenly there came a great gleam of light where his flies fell, and though the fish failed to strike, Frank's heart gave a leap, for he knew now that in this water, though they would be fewer in number, there were trout which were well worth while. He cast again over the dark, foamy pool, and this time the flash was followed by such a tug as at first made him fear that his primitive tackle might not hold. Oh, then he longed for a reel and a net. This was a fish that could not be lightly lifted out, but must be worked to a landing place and dragged ashore. Holding the line taut, he looked for such a spot, and selecting the shallow edge of a flat stone, drew his prize nearer and nearer, drawing in the rod itself, hand over hand, and finally the line until the struggling, leaping capture was in his hands. This was something like. This was sport, indeed. There was no thought now of turning back. To carry home even a few fish, taken with such a tackle, would redeem him for many shortcomings in Constance's eyes. He was sorry now that he had kept any of the smaller fry. He followed down the stream, stepping from boulder to boulder, casting as he went. Here and there trout rose, but they were old and wary and hesitated to strike. He got another at length, somewhat smaller than the first, and lost still another which he thought was larger than either. Then for a considerable distance he whipped the most attractive water without reward, changing his flies at length, but to no purpose. "It must be getting late," he reflected aloud, and for the first time thought of looking at his watch. He was horrified to find that it was nearly 11 o'clock, by which time he had expected to have reached the top of McIntyre and to have been well on his way back to the lodge. He must start at once, for the climb would be long and rough here, out of the regular trail. Yet he paused to make one more cast, over a black pool where there was a fallen log, and bubbles floating on the surface. His arm had grown tired swinging the heavy green rod, and his aim was poor. The flies struck a little twig and hung there, dangling in the air. A twitch, and they were free and had dropped to the surface of the water, yet barely to reach it. For in that instant a wave rolled up and divided, a great black and gold shape made a porpoise leap into the air. The lower fly disappeared, and an instant later Frank was gripping the tough green rod with both hands, while the water and trees and sky blended and swam before him in the intensity of the struggle to hold and to keep holding that black and gold monster at the other end of the tackle, to keep him from getting back under that log, from twisting the line around a limb, in a word, to prevent him from regaining freedom. It would be lunacy to drag this fish ashore by force. The line or the fly would certainly give way, even if the rod would stand. Indeed, when he tried to work his capture a little nearer, it held so like a rock that he believed for a moment the line was already fast. But then came a sudden rush to the right and another stand, and to the left, with a plunge for depth. And with each of these rushes Frank's heart stood still, for he felt that against the power of this monster his tackle could not hold. Every nerve and fiber in his body seemed to concentrate on the slow-moving point of dark line where the tense strand touched the water. A little this way or that it swung, perhaps yielded a trifle, or drew down a bit as the great fish in its battle for life gave an inch only to begin a still fiercer struggle in this final tug of war. To all else the young man was oblivious. A bird dropped down on a branch and shouted at him. He did not hear it. A cloud swept over the sun. He did not see it. Life, death, eternity mattered nothing. Only that moving point of line mattered, only the thought that the powerful, unconquered shape below might presently go free. And then, inch by inch it seemed, the steady wrist and the crude tackle began to gain advantage. The monster of black and gold was forced to yield. Scarcely breathing, Frank watched the point of the line, inch by inch, draw nearer to a little pebbly shore that ran down, where, if anywhere, he could land his prey. Once, indeed, the great fellow came to the surface, then, seeing his captor, made a fierce dive and plunged into a wild struggle. during which hope almost died. Another dragging toward the shore, another struggle and yet another, each becoming weaker and less enduring, until, lo, there on the pebbles, gasping and striking with his splendid tail, lay the conquered king of fish. It required but an instant for the captor to pounce upon him and to secure him with a piece of line through his gills, and this he replaced with a double willow branch, which he could tie together and to the basket, for this fish was altogether too large to go inside. Exhausted and weak from the struggle, Frank sat down to contemplate his capture and to regain strength before starting up the mountain. 5 pounds, certainly, this fish weighed, he thought, and he tenderly regarded the fly that had lured it to the death, and carefully wound up the cheap bit of line that it held true. No such fish had been brought to the lodge, and then, boy that he was, he thought how proud he should be of his triumph, and with what awe Constance would regard his skill in its capture. And in that moment it was somehow borne in upon him that with this battle and this victory there had come, in truth, the awakening, that the indolent, luxury-loving man had become as a sleepwalker of yesterday who would never cross the threshold of today. A drop of water on his hand aroused him. The sun had disappeared, the sky was overcast. There was rain in the air. He must hurry, he thought, and get up the mountain and away, before the storm. He could not see the peak, for here the trees were tall and thick, but he knew his direction by the compass and by the slope of the land. From the end of his late rod he cut a walking stick and set out as rapidly as he could make his way through brush and vines up the mountainside. But it was toilsome work. The mountain became steeper, the growth thicker, his load of fish weighed him down. He was almost tempted to retrace his way up the river and brook to the trail, but was loath to consume such an amount of time when it seemed possible to reach the peak by a direct course. Then it became darker in the woods, and the bushes seemed damp with moisture. He wondered if he was entering a fog that had gathered on the mountain top, and, once there, if he could find what he sought. Only the big fish, swinging at his side and dragging in the leaves as he crept through the underbrush, gave him comfort in what was rapidly becoming an unpleasant and difficult undertaking. Presently he was reduced to climbing hand over hand, clinging to bushes and bracing his feet as best he might. All at once he was face to face with a cliff which rose sheer for 60 feet or more, and which it seemed impossible to ascend. He followed it for a distance and came, at last, to where a heavy vine dropped from above, and this made a sort of ladder, by which, after a great deal of clinging and scrambling, he managed to reach the upper level, where he dropped down to catch breath, only to find, when he came to look for his big fish, that somehow in the upward struggle it had broken loose from the basket and was gone. It was most disheartening. "If I were not a man I would cry," he said wearily. Then, peering over the cliff, he was overjoyed to see the lost fish hanging not far below, suspended by the willow loop he had made. So then he climbed down carefully and secured it, and struggled back again, this time almost faint with weariness, but happy in regaining his treasure. And now he realized that a fog was indeed upon the mountain. At the foot of the cliff and farther down, the air seemed clear enough, but above him, objects only a few feet distant were lost in a white mist, while here and there a drop of rain struck in the leaves. It would not do to waste time. A storm might be gathering, and a tempest, or even a chill rain on the top of McIntyre, was something to be avoided. He rose and, climbing, stooping, crawling, struggled toward the mountain top. The timber became smaller, the tangle closer, the white mist thickened. Often he paused from sheer exhaustion. Once he thought he heard someone call, but listening there came only silence, and staggering to his feet he struggled on. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The Lucky Pete's, A Tale of the North Woods by Albert Bigelow Paine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8 What Came Out of the Mist. It was several hours after Frank Weatherby had set out on the McIntyre trail, when the sun had risen to a point where it came mottling through the tree-tops and dried the vines and bushes along the fragrant, yielding path below, that a girl came following in the way which led up the mountain top. She wore a stout outing costume, short skirt and blouse, heavy boots, and an old felt school hat pinned firmly to luxuriant dark hair. On her arm she carried the basket of many wanderings, and her step was that of health and strength and purpose. One watching Constance Deane unawares, noting her carriage and sureness of foot, the easy grace with which she overcame the various obstructions in her path, might have said that she belonged by right to these woods, was a part of them, and one might have added that she was a perfect flowering of this splendid forest. On the evening before, she had inquired of Robin the precise entrance to the McIntyre trail, and with his general directions she had no hesitation now in setting out on her own account to make the climb which would bring her to the coveted specimens at the mountain top. She would secure them with the aid of no one and so give Frank an exhibition of her independence, and perhaps impress him a little with his own lack of ambition and energy. She had avoided the lodge, making her way around the lake to the trail, and had left no definite word at home as to her destination, for it was quite certain that Mrs. Deane would worry if it became known that Constance had set off up the mountain alone. Yet she felt thoroughly equal to the undertaking. In her basket she carried some sandwiches, and she had no doubt of being able to return to the lodge during the afternoon, where she had a certain half-formed idea of finding Frank disconsolately waiting, a rather comforting, even if pathetic, picture of humiliation. Constance did not linger at the trout brook which had enticed Frank from the narrow upward path, save to dip up a cold drink with the little cup she carried, and to rest up a moment and watch the leaping water as it foamed and sang down the natural stairway which led from one mystery in the dark vistas above to another mystery and wider vistas below, somehow, at last, to reach that deeper and vaster and more impenetrable mystery, the sea. She recalled some old German lines beginning Du Blachlein, Sieberhell und klar, and then she remembered having once recited them to Frank, and how he had repeated them in an English translation. Thou brooklet, silver bright and clear, forever passing, always here, upon thy brink I sit, and think, whence comest thou, whence goest thou? He had not confessed it, but she suspected the translation to be his own, and it had exasperated her that one who could do a thing well and with such facility should set so little store by his gift, when another, with a heart hunger for achievement, should have been left so unfavored of the gods. She walked rather more slowly when she had passed the brook, musing upon these things. Then presently the path became precipitous and narrow, and led through thick bushes, and over or under difficult obstructions. Constance drew on a thick pair of gloves to grapple with rough limbs and sharp points of rock. Here and there were fairly level stretches and easy going, but for the most part it was up and up, steeper and steeper, over stones and logs, through heavy bushes and vines that matted across the trail, so that one must stoop down and burrow like a rabbit not to miss the way. Miss Deane began to realize presently that the McIntyre trail was somewhat less easy than she had anticipated. "If Robin calls this an easy trail, I should like to know what he means by a hard one," she commented aloud, as she made her way through a great tumble of logs, only to find that the narrow path disappeared into a clump of bushes beyond, and apparently brought up plump against a plunging waterfall on the other side. One would have to be a perfect salmon to scale that. But arriving at the foot of the fall, she found that the trail merely crossed the pool below and was clearly marked beyond. This was the brook which Frank had not reached. It was no great distance from the summit. But now the climb became steeper than ever, a hand-over-hand affair, with scratched face and torn dress and frequent pauses for breath. There was no longer any tall timber, but only masses of dwarfed and twisted little oak trees, a few feet high, though gnarled and gray with age, and loaded with acorns. Constance knew these for the scrub oak, that degenerate but persistent little scion of a noble race, that pushes its miniature forests to the very edge and into the last crevice of the barren mountain top. Soon this diminutive wilderness began to separate into segments, and the trail reached a comparative level. Then suddenly it became solid rock, with only here and there a clump of the stunted oak or a bit of grass. The girl realized that she must be on the summit and would presently reach the peak, where, from a crevice, grew the object of her adventure. She paused a moment for breath, and to straighten her disheveled hair. Also, she turned for a look at the view which she thought must lie behind her. But she gave a little cry of disappointment. A white wraith of mist, like the very ghost of a cloud, was creeping silently along the mountainside and veiled the vision of the wide lands below. Where she stood the air was still clear, but she imagined the cloud was creeping nearer and would presently envelop the mountain top. She would hurry to the peak and try to get a view from the other side, which after all was considered the best outlook. The trail now led over solid granite, and could be followed only by little cairns or heaps of stone, placed at some distance apart, but in the clear air easily seen from one to the other. She moved rapidly, for the way was no longer steep, and ere long the tripod which marked the highest point, and near which Robin had seen the strange waxen flower, was outlined against the sky. A moment later, when she looked, it seemed to her less clear. The air, too, had a chill damp feeling. She turned quickly to look behind her, and uttered a little cry of surprise that was almost terror. The cloud ghost was upon her. She was already enveloped in its trailing cerements. Behind, all was white, and when she turned again the tripod, too, had well nigh disappeared. As if about to lose the object of her quest, she started to run, and when an instant later the beacon was lost in a thick fold of white, she again opened her lips in a wild, desperate cry. Yet she did not stop, but raced on, forgetting even the little guiding cairns which pointed the way. It would have made no difference had she remembered them, for the cloud became so dense that she could not have seen one from the other. How close it shut her in, this wall of white, as impalpable and as opaque as the smoke of burning grass. It seemed a long way to the tripod. It must have been farther than she had thought. Suddenly she realized that the granite no longer rose a little before her, but seemed to drop away. She had missed the tripod then, and was descending on the other side. Turning, she retraced her steps, more slowly now, trying to keep the upward slope before her. But soon she realized that in this thick and mystifying whiteness she could not be certain of the level, that by thinking so she could make the granite seem to slope a little up or down, and in the same manner, now, she could set the tripod in any direction from her at will. Confused, half terrified at the thought, she stood perfectly still, trying to think. The tripod, she knew, could not be more than a few yards distant, but surrounded by these enchanted walls which ever receded, yet always closed about her, she must only wander helplessly and find it by mere chance. And suppose she found it? And suppose she secured the object of her search, how, in this blind spot, would she find her way back to the trail? She recalled now what Robin had said of keeping the trail in the fog. Her heart became cold, numb. The chill mist had crept into her very veins. She was lost, lost as men have been lost in the snow, to die almost within their own dooryards. If this dread cloud would only pass, all would be well, but she remembered, too, hopelessly enough, that she had told no one of her venture, that no one would know where to seek her. And now the sun also must be obscured, for the world was darkening. An air that pierced her very marrow blew across the mountain, and a drop of rain struck her cheek. Oh, it would be wretched without shelter to face a storm in that bleak spot. She must at least try. She must make every effort to find the trail. She set out in what she believed to be a wide circuit of the peak, and was suddenly rejoiced to come upon one of the little piles of stones which she thought must be one of the cairns, leading to the trail. But which way must she look for the next? She strained her eyes through the milky gloom, but could distinguish nothing beyond a few yards of granite at her feet. It did not avail her to remain by the cairn, yet she dreaded to leave a spot which was at least a point in the human path. She did so, at last, only to wander down into an unmarked waste, to be brought all at once against a segment of the scrub oak forest, and to find before her a sort of opening which she thought might be the trail. Eagerly, in the gathering gloom, she examined the face of the granite for some trace of human foot, and imagined she could make out a mark here and there as of boot nails. Then she came to a bit of grass that seemed trampled down. Her heart leaped. Oh, this must be the trail after all. She hastened forward, half running in her eagerness. Branches slapped and tore at her garments. Long, tenuous filaments, wet and web-like, drew across her face. Twice she fell and bruised herself cruelly. And when she rose the second time, her heart stopped with fear, for she lay just on the edge of a ghastly precipice, the bottom of which was lost in mist and shadows. It had only been a false trail, after all. Weak and trembling, she made her way back to the open summit, fearing even that she might miss this now and so be without the last hope of finding the way, or of being found at last herself. Back on the solid granite once more, she made a feeble effort to find one of the cairns, or the tripod, anything that had known the human touch. But now into her confused senses came the recollection that many parties climbed McIntyre, and she thought that one such might have chosen today and be somewhere within call. She stood still to listen for possible voices, but there was no sound, and the bitter air across the summit made her shrink and tremble. Then she uttered a loud, long "Hoo-woo!" a call she had learned of mountaineers as a child. She listened breathlessly for an answer. It was no use. Yet she would call again, at least it was an effort, a last hope. "Hoo-woo!" And again, "Hoo-woo!" And then her very pulse ceased, for somewhere, far away it seemed, from behind that wall of white her ear caught an answering cry. Once more she called, this time wildly, with every bit of power she could summon. Once more came the answering "Hoo-woo!" and now it seemed much nearer. She started to run in the direction of the voice, stopping every few steps to call, and to hear the reassuring reply. She was at the brushy edge of the summit when through the mist came the words. It was a man's voice, and it made her heart leap. "Stay where you are. Don't move. I will come to you." She stood still, for in that voice there was a commanding tone which she was only too eager to obey. She called again and again, but she waited, and all at once, right in front of her, it seemed, the voice said: "Well, Connie, it's a good thing I found you. If you had played around here much longer you might have got wet." But Constance was in no mood to take the matter lightly. "Frank! Oh, Frank!" she cried, and half running, half reeling forward, she fell into his arms. And then for a little she gave way and sobbed on his shoulder, just as any girl might have done who had been lost and miserable and had all at once found the shoulder of a man she loved. Then, brokenly, "Oh, Frank, how did you know I was here?" His arm was about her and he was holding her close. But for the rest he was determined to treat it lightly. "Well, you know," he said, "you made a good deal of noise about it, and I thought I recognized the tones." "But how did you come to set out to look for me? How did you know that I came? Oh, it was brave of you, in this awful fog, and with no guide." She believed then that he had set out purposely to search for her. He would let her think so for the moment. "Why, that's nothing," he said. "A little run up the mountain is just fun for me, and as for fogs, I've always had a weakness for fogs since a winter in London. I didn't really know you were up here, but that might be the natural conclusion if you weren't at home, or at the Lodge, after what happened yesterday, of course." "Oh, Frank, forgive me. I was so horrid yesterday." "Don't mention it. I didn't give it a second thought." "But, Frank—" Then suddenly she stopped, for her eye had caught the basket, and the great fish dangling at his side. "Frank," she concluded, "where in the world did you get that enormous trout?" It was no use after that, so he confessed and briefly told her the tale. How it was by accident that he had found her. How he had set out at daybreak to find the wonderful flower. "And haven't you found it either?" he asked, glancing down at her basket. Then, in turn, she told how she had missed the tripod just as the fog came down and could not get near it again. "And, oh, I have lost my luncheon, too," she exclaimed. "And you must be starving. I must have lost it when I fell." "Then we'll waste no time in getting home. It's beginning to rain a little now. We'll be pretty miserable if we stay up here any longer." "But the trail. How will you find it in this awful mist?" "Well, it should be somewhere to the west, I think, and with the compass, you see—" He had been feeling in a pocket and now stared at her blankly. "I am afraid I have lost something, too," he exclaimed. "My compass. I had it a little while ago and put it in the change pocket of my coat to have it handy. I suppose the last time I fell down it slipped out." He searched hastily in his other pockets, but to no purpose. "Never mind," he concluded cheerfully. "All ways lead down the mountain. If we can't find the trail we can at least go down till we find something. If it's a brook or ravine we'll follow that till we get somewhere. Anything is better than shivering here." They set out in the direction where it seemed to Frank the trail must lie. Suddenly a tall shape loomed up before them. It was the tripod. "Oh!" Constance gasped. "And I hunted for it so long." "Those flowers, or whatever they were, should be over here, I think," Frank said, and Constance produced a little plan which Robin had given her. But when in the semi-dusk they groped to the spot, only some wet blackened pulp remained of the curious growth. The tender flower of the peak had perhaps bloomed and perished in a day. Frank lamented this misfortune, but Constance expressed a slighter regret. They made an effort now to locate the cairns, but with less success. They did not find even one, and after wandering about for a little could not find the tripod again either. "Never mind," consoled Frank. "We'll trust a little to instinct. Perhaps it will lead us to something." In fact, they came presently to the fringe of scrub oak, and to what seemed an open way. But Constance shook her head. "I do not think this is the beginning of the trail. I followed just such an opening, and it led me to that dreadful cliff." Perhaps it was the same false lead, for presently an abyss yawned before them. "I shouldn't wonder," speculated Frank, "if this isn't a part of the cliff that I climbed. If we follow along, it may lead us to the same place. Then we may be able to make our way over it and down to the river, and so home. It's a long way, but a sure one, if we can only find it." They proceeded cautiously along the brink, for the light was dim and the way uncertain. They grew warmer now, for they were away from the bitter air of the mountain top, and in constant motion. When they had followed the cliff for perhaps half a mile, Frank suddenly stopped. "What is it?" asked Constance. "Is this where you climbed up?" Her companion only pointed over the brink. "Look," he said. "It is not a cliff here, but one side of a chasm. I can see trees on the other side." Sure enough, dimly through the gloom, not many feet away, appeared the outline of timber of considerable growth, showing that they had descended somewhat, also an increased depth of soil. It was further evident that the cañon was getting narrower, and presently they came upon two logs, laid across it side by side, forming a sort of bridge. Frank knelt and examined them closely. "Some one has used this," he said. "This may be a trail. Do you think we can get over, Connie?" The girl looked at the narrow crossing and at the darkening woods beyond. It was that period of stillness and deepening gloom which precedes a mountain storm. Still early in the day, one might easily believe that night was descending. Constance shuddered. She was a bit nervous and unstrung. "There is something weird about it," she said. "It is like entering the enchanted forest. Oh, I can cross well enough. It isn't that." And stepping lightly on the little footway, she walked as steadily and firmly as did Frank a moment later. "You're a brick, Connie," he said heartily. An opening in the bushes at the end of the little bridge revealed itself. They entered and pushed along, for the way led downward. The darkness grew momentarily. Rain was beginning to fall. Yet they hurried on, single file, Frank leading and parting the vines and limbs to make the way easier for his companion. They came presently to a little open space, where suddenly he halted. "There's a light," he said. "It must be a camp." But Constance clung to his arm. It was now quite dark where they stood, and there came a low roll of thunder overhead. "Oh, suppose it is something dreadful," she whispered. "A robber's den, or moonshiners. I've heard of such things." "It's more likely to be a witch," said Frank, "or an ogre, but I think we must risk it." The rain came faster, and they hurried forward now, and presently stood at the door of a habitation, though even in the mist and gloom it impressed them as being of a curious sort. There was a window and a light, certainly, but the window held no sash, and the single opening was covered with a sort of skin or parchment. There was a door, too, and walls, but beyond this the structure seemed as a part of the forest itself, with growing trees forming the door and corner posts, while others rose apparently from the roof. Further outlines of this unusual structure were lost in the dimness. Under the low sheltering eaves they hesitated. "Shall we knock?" whispered Constance. "It is all so queer, so uncanny. I feel as if it might be the home of a real witch or magician, or something like that." "Then we may at least learn our fate," Frank answered, and with his knuckles struck 3 raps on the heavy door. At first there was silence, then a sound of movement within, followed by a shuffling step. A moment later the heavy door swung ajar, and in the dim light from within Frank and Constance beheld a tall, bowed figure standing in the opening. In a single brief glance they saw that it was a man, also that his appearance, like that of his house, was unusual. He was dressed entirely in skins. His beard was upon his breast, and his straggling hair fell about his shoulders. He stood wordless, silently regarding the strangers, and Frank at first was at a loss for utterance. Then he said, hesitatingly: "We missed our way on the mountain. We want shelter from the storm, and directions to the trail that leads to Spruce Lodge." Still the tall bent figure in the doorway made no movement and uttered no word. They could not see his face, but Constance felt that his eyes were fixed upon her, and she clung closer to Frank's arm. Yet when the strange householder spoke at last there was nothing to cause fear, either in his words or tone. His voice was gentle, not much above a whisper. "I crave your pardon if I seem slow of hospitality," he said quaintly, "but a visitor seldom comes to my door. Only one other has ever found his way here, and he comes not often." He pushed the rude door wider on its creaking withe hinges. "I bid you welcome," he added, then, as Constance came more fully into the light shed by a burning pine knot and an open fire, he stopped, stared at her still more fixedly, and muttered something under his breath. But a moment later he said gently, his voice barely more than a whisper: "I pray you will pardon my staring, but in that light just now you recalled some one, a woman it was, I used to know. Besides, I have not been face to face with any woman for nearly a score of years." Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of The Lucky Peace, A Tale of the North Woods, by Albert Bigelow Paine. Recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. A Shelter in the Forest. Certainly the house of the hermit, for such he undoubtedly was, proved a remarkable place. There was no regular form to the room in which Frank and Constance found themselves, nor could they judge as to its size. Its outlines blended into vague shadows, evidently conforming to the position of the growing trees which constituted its supports. The walls were composed of logs of varying lengths, adjusted to the spaces between the trees, intermingled with stones and smaller branches, the whole cemented or mud plastered together in a concrete mass. At the corner of the fireplace, and used as one end of it, was a larger flat stone, which became not only a part of the wall, but served as a wide shelf or table within, and this, covered with skins, supported a large wooden bowl of nuts, a stone hammer somewhat resembling a tomahawk, a few well-worn books, also a field glass in a leather case, such as tourists use. On a heavy rustic mantel were numerous bits and tokens of the forest, and suspended above it on wooden hooks was a handsome rifle. On the hearth below was a welcome blaze, with a heavy wooden settle, wide of seat, upon which skins were thrown, drawn up comfortably before the fire. The other furniture in the room consisted of a high-backed armchair, a wooden table, and what might have been a bench, outlined in the dimness of a far corner, where the ceiling seemed to descend almost to the ground, and did, in fact, join the top of a low mound which formed the wall on that side. But what seemed most remarkable in this singular dwelling place were the living trees which here and there like columns supported the roof. The heavy riven shingles and a thatching of twisted grass had been fitted closely about them above, and the hewn or puncheon floor was carefully joined round them below. Lower limbs had been converted into convenient hooks, while attached here and there near the ceiling were several rustic nest-like receptacles, showing a fringe of grass and leaves. As Frank and Constance entered this strange shelter there had been a slight scurrying of shadowy forms, a whisking into these safe retreats. And now, as the strangers stood in the cheerful glow of the fire and the sputtering pine knot, they were regarded not only by the hermit, but by a score or more of other half-curious, half-timid eyes that shone bright out of the vague dimness behind. The ghostly scampering, the shadowy flitting, and a small, subdued chatter from the dusk enhanced in the minds of the visitors a certain weird impression of the place and constrained their speech. There was no sensation of fear. It was only a vague uneasiness, or rather that they felt themselves harsh and unwarranted intruders upon a habitation and a life in which they had no part. Their host broke the silence. "You must needs pardon the demeanor of my little friends," he said. "They are unaccustomed to strangers." He indicated the settle and added, "Be seated. You are weary without doubt, and your clothes seem damp." Then he noticed the basket and the large fish at Frank's belt. "A fine trout," he said. "I have not seen so large a one for years." Frank nodded with an anxious interest. "Would you like it?" he asked. "I have a basketful besides, and would it be possible could we, I mean, manage to cook a few of them? I am very hungry, and I am sure my companion, Miss Deane, would like a bite also." Constance had dropped down on the settle, and was leaning toward the fire, her hands outspread before it. "I am famished," she confessed, and added, "Oh, and will you let me cook the fish? I can do it quite well." The hermit did not immediately reply to the question. "Miss Deane," he mused, "that is your name, then?" "Yes, Constance Deane, and this is Mr. Frank Weatherby. We have been lost on the mountain all day without food. We shall be so thankful if you will let us prepare something, and will then put us on the trail that leads to Spruce Lodge." The hermit stirred the fire to a brighter blaze and laid on a fresh piece of wood. "That I will do right gladly," he said, "if you will accept my humble ways. Let me take the basket. I will set about the matter." Gladly enough, Frank unloosed his burden and surrendered the big trout and the basket to his host. As the latter turned away from the fire, a dozen little forms frisked out of the shadows behind and ran over him lightly, climbing to his shoulders, into his pockets, clinging on to his curious dress wherever possible, chattering, and still regarding the strange intruders with bright, inquisitive eyes. They were tiny red squirrels, it seemed, and their home was here in this nondescript dwelling with this eccentric man. Suddenly the hermit spoke to them, an unknown word with queer intonation. In an instant the little bevy of chatterers leaped away from him, scampering back to their retreats. Frank, who stood watching, saw a number of them go racing to a tree of goodly size and disappear into a hole near the floor. The hermit turned, smiling a little, and the firelight fell on his face. For the first time Frank noticed the refinement and delicacy of the meager features. The hermit said, "That is their outlet. The tree is hollow and there is another opening above the roof. In winter the birds use it too." He disappeared now into what seemed to be another apartment, shutting a door behind. Frank dropped down on the settle by Constance, thoroughly tired, stretched out his legs and gave himself up to the comfort of the warm glow. "Isn't it all wonderful?" murmured Constance. "It is just a dream, of course. We are not really here, and I shall wake up presently. I had just such fancies when I was a child. Perhaps I am still wandering in that awful mist, and this is the delirium. Oh, are you sure we are really here?" "Quite sure," said Frank. "And it seems just a matter of course to me. I have known all along that this wood was full of mysteries, enchantments, and hermits, and the like. Probably there are many such things if we knew where to look for them." The girl's voice dropped still lower. "How quaintly he talks! It is as if he had stepped out of some old book." Frank nodded toward the stone shelf by the fire. "He lives chiefly in books, I fancy, having had but one other visitor." The young man lifted one of the worn volumes and held it to the light. It was a copy of Shakespeare's works, a thick book, being a complete edition of the plays. He laid it back tenderly. "He dwells with the men and women of the Master," he said softly. There followed a little period of silence during which they drank in the cheer and comfort of the blazing hearth. Outside, the thunder rolled heavily now and then, and the rain beat against the door. What did it matter? They were safe and sheltered and together. Constance asked presently, "What time is it?" And looking at his watch, Frank replied, "A little after 3. An hour ago we were wandering up there in the mist. It seems a year since then and a lifetime since I took that big trout." "It is ages since I started this morning," mused Constance. "Yet we divide each day into the same measurements, and by the clock it is only a little more than 6 hours." "It is 9 since I left the Lodge," reflected Frank, "after a very light and informal breakfast at the kitchen door. Yes, I am willing to confess that such time should not be measured in the ordinary way." There was a sharper crash of thunder and a heavier gust of rain. Then a fierce downpour that came to them in a steady, muffled roar. "When shall we get home?" Constance asked anxiously. "We won't worry now. Likely this is only a shower. It will not take long to get down the mountain, once we're in the trail and it's light, you know, until 7." The door behind was pushed open and the hermit re-entered. He bore a flat stone and a wooden bowl and knelt down with them before the fire. The glowing embers he heaped together and with the aid of a large pebble set the flat stone at an angle before them. Then from the wooden bowl he emptied a thick paste of coarse meal upon the baking stone and smothered it with a wooden paddle. Rising, he said, "I fear my rude ways will not appetize you, but I can only offer you what cheer I have." The aroma of the cooking meal began to fill the room. "Please don't apologize," pleaded Constance. "My only hope is that I can restrain myself until the food is ready." "I'll ask you to watch the bread for a moment," the hermit said, turning the stone a little. "And if I let it burn you may punish me as the good wife did King Alfred," answered Constance. Then a glow came into her cheeks that was not all of the fire, for the man's eyes, they were deep, burning eyes, were fixed upon her and he seemed to hang on her every word. Yet he smiled without replying and again disappeared. "Connie," admonished Frank, "if you let anything happen to that cake, I'll eat the stone." So they watched the pone carefully, turning it now and then, though the embers glowed very hot and a certain skill was necessary. The hermit returned presently with a number of the trout dressed, and these were in a frying pan that had a long wooden handle, which Constance and Frank held between them, while their host installed 2 large potatoes in the hot ashes. Then he went away for a little, and placed some things on the table in the middle of the room, returning now and then to superintend matters. And presently the fish and the cakes and the potatoes were ready, and the ravenous wanderers did not wait to be invited twice to partake of them. The thunder still rolled at intervals, and the rain still beat at the door, but they did not heed. Within, the cheer, if not luxurious, was plenteous and grateful. The table furnishings were rude and chiefly of home make. But the guests were young, strong of health and appetite, and no king's table could have supplied goodlier food. Oh, never were there such trout as those, never such baked potatoes, nor never such hot, delicious hoe cake. And beside each plate stood a bowl of fruit, berries, delicious fresh raspberries of the hills. Presently their host poured a steaming liquid into each of the empty cups by their plates. "Perhaps you will not relish my tea," he said, "but it is soothing and not harmful. It is drawn from certain roots and herbs I have gathered, and it is not ill-tasting. Here is sweet, also, made from the maple tree." An aromatic odor arose from the cups, and when Constance tasted the beverage and added a lump of the sugar, she declared the result delicious, a decision in which Frank willingly concurred. The host himself did not join the feast, and presently fell to cooking another pan of trout. It was a marvel how they disappeared. Even the squirrels came out of their hiding places to witness this wonderful feasting, a few bolder ones leaping upon the table, as was their wont, to help themselves from a large bowl of cracked nuts. And all this delighted the visitors. Everything was so extraordinary, so simple and near to nature, so savoring of the romance of the old days. This wide, rambling room, with its recesses lost in the shadows, the low, dim roof supported by its living columns, the glowing fireplace and the blazing knot, the wild pelts scattered here and there, and the curious skin-clad figure in the firelight. Certainly these were things to stir delightfully the heart of youth, to set curious fancies flitting through the brain. "Oh," murmured Constance, "I wish we might stay in a place like this forever." Then, reddening, added hastily, I mean "Yes," agreed Frank, "I mean that, too, and I wish just the same. We could have fish every day, and such hoe cake, and this nice tea, and I would pick berries like these, and you could gather mushrooms, and we would have squirrels to amuse us, and you would read to me, and perhaps I should write poems of the hills and the storms and the haunted woods, and we could live so close to nature and drink so deeply of its ever-renewing youth that old age could not find us, and we should live on and be always happy, happy ever after." The girl's hand lay upon the table, and when his heavier palm closed over it she did not draw it away. "I can almost love you when you are like this," she whispered. "And if I am always like this?" They spoke very low, and the hermit sat in the high-backed chair, bowed and staring into the blaze. Yet perhaps something of what they said drifted to his ear. Perhaps it was only old and troubling memories stirring within him that caused him to rise and walk back and forth before the fire. His guests had finished now, and they came back presently to the big, deep settle, happy in the comfort of the plenteous food, the warmth and the cozy seat, and the wild unconvention of it all. The beat of the rain did not trouble them. Secretly they were glad of any excuse for remaining by the hermit's hearth. Their host did not appear to notice them at first, but paced a turn up and down, then seated himself in the high-backed chair and gazed into the embers. A bevy of the little squirrels crept up and scaled his knees and shoulders, but with that curious note of warning he sent them scampering. The pine knot sputtered low and he tossed it among the coals, where it renewed its blaze. For a time there was silence, with only the rain sobbing at the door. Then by and by, very, very softly, as one who muses aloud, he spoke. "I, too, have had my dreams, dreams which were ever of happiness for me, and for another. Happiness that would not end, yet which was to have no more than its rare beginning. That was a long time ago, as many as 30 years, maybe. I have kept but a poor account of time, for what did it matter here?" He turned a little to Constance. "Your face and voice, young lady, bring it all back now, and stir me to speak of it again, the things of which I have spoken to no one before, not even to Robin." "To Robin?" The words came involuntarily from Constance. "Yes, Robin Farnham, now of the Lodge. He found his way here once, just as you did. It was in his early days on the mountains, and he came to me out of a white mist, just as you came, and I knew him for her son." Constance started, but the words on her lips were not uttered. "I knew him for her son," the hermit continued, "even before he told me his name, for he was her very picture, and his voice, the voice of a boy, was her voice. He brought her back to me, he made her live again, here in this isolated spot, even as she had lived in my dreams. Even as a look in your face and a tone in your voice have made her live for me again to-day." There was something in the intensity of the man's low speech, almost more than in what he said, to make the listener hang upon his words. Frank, who had drawn near Constance, felt that she was trembling, and he laid his hand firmly over hers, where it rested on the seat beside him. "Yet I never told him," the voice went on. "I never told Robin that I knew him. I never spoke his mother's name. For I had a fear that it might sadden him, that the story might send him away from me. And I could have told nothing unless I told it all, and there was no need. So I spoke to him no word of her, and I pledged him to speak to no one of me. For if men knew, the curious would come, and I would never have my life the same again. So I made him promise, and after that first time he came as he chose. And when he is here, she who was a part of my happy dream lives again in him. And to you I may speak of her, for to you it does not matter, and it is in my heart now, where my days are not many, to recall old dreams." End of chapter 9.